All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's panel, Africa's Emerging Energy Economy. As most of you have found, there's food and there's drink in the back. If you're done eating with what's on your plate and you feel like you need some more on your plate, everybody up here is okay with that. So go back and get seconds, thirds, get refills or whatever. And for all the latecomers, just like in class, there are plenty of seats in the front. We're really glad to have you here today. My name is Trey Grayson. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics down at the Kennedy School and also a recovering lawyer. Today's program is presented by the program on the legal profession here at HLS, and it's co-sponsored by two groups that wouldn't necessarily, you'd think, would co-sponsor groups together until you know the topic, which is the Harvard African Law Students Association and the Harvard Law School Texas Club. So energy in Africa makes sense that they would come together, and we're really glad to have their co-sponsorship to help promote and put this event together. On each of your chairs are detailed biographies of the three panelists, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail for that reason, so that'll give more time for them to talk and for you all to ask questions of them. But we're going to start here on my immediate left, and I'll just do quick intros for the three of them, and then Ahmed will start, and then David, and then Sean. Ahmed El-Gaili is the managing partner of Vinson and Elkins in their UAE office, and we're really excited to have him here. He's going to kick off first. David Wilkins, who all of you probably know, directs the program on legal profession here at the law school and is a prolific teacher and writer and thinker on all things involving the law and the profession. And then Sean Long is the CEO of Endeavor Energy and has many years of work investing in Africa. And so you've got three great experts, and we'll start with Ahmed, and we'll go further. And when they're finished, we'll have questions. We've got a microphone up here. I'll come back up and we'll call on you guys. So thanks.
Thank you. Good afternoon, or I guess it is afternoon by now. I want to start by just a few remarks about what kind of practice law firms typically do in Africa today, specifically what V&E is doing in Africa, but also talk a little bit about what's involved there and whether the proposition that there's something uniquely different about practicing in Africa is a valid proposition or not. By way of background, I'm originally from Africa. I'm originally from the Sudan, but I grew up in the Middle East and here, just down in the yard, studied African and Middle East economic development before coming to the law school. So what are we doing today in Africa, and why are we doing it, and how did we get there? I mean, the legal press has been talking about Africa considerably for the last couple of years, how Africa is the new frontier. We've been doing work in Africa for over 10, 15 years now. And not surprisingly, because we are an energy-focused firm, most of that work has been in the energy space. And by energy, I'm using the term rather broadly. So upstream is probably where most of the transactions are happening. And in that space, basically the typical trend is you have smaller players or mid-sized oil companies coming in and finding significant amounts of hydrocarbons, and at that point, those hydrocarbons start trading hands between them and the larger oil companies. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, we've done about 40 to 50 upstream transactions of that size, ranging from the small $10, $20 million deals to, and I'm going to get into that as a real trend happening, to the multi-billion-dollar deal. And those in the last, and that's why Africa started getting on people's maps, because of those big transactions. We worked last year on one such transaction for the Chinese Sinopec when they acquired a third of Apache's assets in Egypt. Now, that transaction is very symptomatic of what's happening in Africa and how international geopolitics are affecting the interests of global players as well, and as a result, international lawyers. You had a company like Apache with very high concentration in an increasingly unstable country like Egypt, wishing to de-risk, if you will, and they were very keen sellers in that context. And then on the other side of that coin, you had the Chinese, who are increasingly energy hungry and trying to secure resources both in the hydrocarbons or foods, et cetera, across the world, but particularly in Africa. That trend we saw a couple of years ago. We worked with the Chinese when they acquired, and that was a stock exchange acquisition of a Canadian company at ADAX. It was an $8 billion deal, and they had about 20 plus properties in Africa. But we also work with the Pioneers, Devons of the world. We worked with Pioneer in a deal in Tunisia. We're advising another mid-size upstream company on a possible pipeline, because once you find the oil, you need to actually be able to get it to markets to monetize the discovery. And as well, on the other side of energy, Sean will talk a little more about the power side of the story. We haven't seen a lot of that from our side, mainly because the regulatory model hasn't been in place until fairly recently, and we can talk about that in the question and answer period. But we did an acquisition and a construction of a power plant for Mubadala Petroleum, which is a sovereign wealth fund in the UAE, in Algeria. And we're also representing them on a mining transaction in Guinea. And that's because they're also interested in securing the feedstock for an aluminum smelter they have, which is going to be the largest in the world. So they wanted to go up the chain to make sure they control the full value chain there. That's just a sample of the work that is being done. We've done a little bit of work in the renewable space, which is becoming increasingly relevant in Africa. We worked on a wind deal for Suez a couple of years ago, and the largest solar project in the world is being considered in Africa, which is Desert Tech. Whether it's going to happen or not remains to be seen. But power, as you'll hear from Sean, is becoming increasingly relevant. Now I'll just speak for just a brief minute about what is different and what is similar about practicing in Africa. I guess if I learned anything from my political economy classes back in college, it's that the proposition of African exceptionalism is not true. And what you have in Africa, and I've done work in Africa, in the Middle East, obviously, as well as in the Caspian, there's a very similar trend that you see in a lot of these countries. And the path from being a frontier market to being an emerging market has a lot of common steps that a lot of these countries are witnessing, and especially for us as lawyers. So the problems that I'm seeing today in Africa, whether issues of governance, issues of legal uncertainty, difficulty in dealing with political risk, all of these are actually not quintessentially African problems, although for historical and other reasons, there has been a concentration of those problems in Africa. So I'm happy to discuss that a little more at length in the Q&A session, but I figured I'd just get it out there as one of the themes that I'd like to touch on.
So thank you. They've given me the role of being in between the real lawyer and the real business guy. So I will try to be short because you should be listening to them. And in fact, that's who I want to listen to. So, and these are two real experts on Africa, and I'm just a novice. So but my guess is that may be true of many of you as well. So the first thing I want to do is just commend all of the students who are here, because you're doing something, excuse me, very smart that a few years ago, I would say this room would have been half full, and it would have been mostly people who had already had a real connection with Africa. My guess is many of you are here because you're interested in where the future is, and all I can say is Africa is unquestionably going to be where the future is for your generation. So just to throw out, I'm an academic, so I do statistics. So International Monetary Fund, all of you know, did a projection in 2010 on world GDP, where it was in 2010 by region, and a prediction of where it was going to be in 2050, so 40 years later. Won't surprise you that the U.S., UK, North America, Western Europe, the West, in 2010 accounted for 41% of all the world's GDP. Now, if I were teaching this class, and actually I have a few former students here, but I promise you I won't do that, I would ask you, where do you predict, the IMF predicts, that number will be in 2050? I don't think there's a single person even reading today's paper who would argue that it's going to go up, right? Everybody thinks it's going to go down. The only question is how far it's going to go down. Here's what they said in 2010. It's going to go to 18%. Now, I didn't say the U.S. share is going to 18%. I said the West share, and what we think of as the North and the West, is going to 18%. Where is it going to go? Well, we all know the rise of Asia. They predict Asia and the West are essentially going to switch places, and Asia is going to go from 27% to 49% of the world GDP, with China being the largest economy in the world. But that's not what brings us here today. They predict that Sub-Saharan Africa is going to go from 2% to 12% of world GDP, making it the fastest growing region in the world. And if you add the Middle East and North Africa, you get to 21%, which means if you're doing your math, according to the IMF, Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East could account for more of the world's GDP than everything we think of as the developed world today. Now, if that doesn't get your attention, I'm not quite sure what will. And they could be wrong. I mean, I just was reading the FT yesterday. There's lots of stories that there are lots of bumps in the road. But even if they're wrong by 25%, even if they're wrong by 50%, that means that the people who invest in Africa today, and not just as this brilliant guy is doing by investing his resources, I'm just talking about your time, your attention, your engagement, learning about the culture, learning about the region, are going to be like my generation who invested in China in the 1970s and the early 1980s. We thought those people were insane. What were they doing? China? What's that ever going to be? Okay. You see how that story turned out? That's my prediction. And this is particularly true for lawyers. Most of you are law students, although maybe some of you, we probably brought some people from the Kennedy School here. And by the way, thanks so much for coming over. It's as if we live like 500 miles apart. I know. We're going to make it, you don't need a passport. We'll let you. So lawyers are a lagging, not a leading indicator, meaning we follow the money, as the story goes, right? Kurt Vonnegut, anybody know the great writer? One of the first lines of one of his books, I forget which one, is that just like an airplane should always be looking for a place to land, lawyers should be looking for places where money changes hands. And money is changing hands increasingly in these regions. So as some of you know, I run a big global research project out of Harvard in the program on the legal profession, which we call Globalization, Lawyers, and Emerging Economies, or GLEE, as we like to call it. So no one will ever forget. I don't wear a tracksuit and I don't sing, but I do study the way in which globalization is reshaping the market for legal services, with particular attention to the emerging economies. And of course, I started where everybody starts, with the BRICS. Actually, not quite the BRICS. I started with the BICS because I couldn't figure out Russia, and I still can't. And if anybody can help me with that, I'd be very helpful. But we started with China and Brazil and India. And we have 50 researchers on the ground looking at everything from the growth of large law firms to in-house legal departments to cross-border M&A to the transformation of legal education to the growth of public interest in pro bono law to capacity building in the institutions of global governance. This is a very exciting project, and I have to raise money for my projects because Harvard doesn't give me any for it. So I would go around and talk to people, and I'd say, we're studying China and India and Brazil, and they'd say, great, great, great. Then I'd say, yeah, and I'm thinking about going to Africa too, and they say, oh, that's what we want to know. every general counsel of every Fortune 500 or global company, excuse me, I talk to wants to know about Africa, because they all know that they want to be there, and they all don't have a clue about what that means. If it's hard enough, excuse me, I'll tell you why my voice is bad in a second, because it's relevant to this story. If it's hard enough to figure out Russia or India, or China or Brazil, Africa is, how many, 56 countries? With many different languages and many different cultures. Where to be, how to be is incredibly confusing. Energy is just the tip of the iceberg. Africa is the fastest growing cell phone market in the world. It has one of the fastest growing middle classes in the world, which is why Walmart is totally focused on going to Africa and opening stores. There is tremendous opportunity. The reason why my voice is bad is that I just got off a plane late last night from Oslo. I was in Stockholm and Oslo talking to lawyers and general counsels there, and guess what they wanted to talk about? Africa. Okay, Norway, of course, which has a big oil industry. I talked to the general counsel of the biggest company in Norway, and they're totally focused on places like Angola, Nigeria, thinking about what the global energy market is. It's why that a great firm like Vinson and Elkins appreciates my friend here even more than they used to, okay? And you know when they really started to appreciate him? When Norton Rose bought Fulbright. Why? Because they wanted to put together the global energy market. And guess what? Texas is a stop on the global energy market. It's no longer a whole other country, as they used to say. So that's a way of saying this is where the future is coming. And all of us need to learn about it. And because I really actually don't know that much about it, I'm going to turn it over to somebody who does. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is a bigger pleasure for me to be here than you guys, I think, will realize, because it's brought back so many memories.
Good or bad?
And I have a million stories I could share with you. One of which I'll tell you, Lauren, you're doing the right thing, and everything Professor Wilkins has said is it should ring true. I spend a lot of my time talking to, by the way, Vinson and Elkins and Norton Rose are both, I'm clients of both of them. And I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to keep their fees down for the work we're doing.
Get what you pay for.
But I can tell you some stories. Number one, I went to Columbia Law School. My background, similar to Lauren's, is went to West Point, thought I was going to be a computer engineer. Never worked as an engineer, even though I majored in that field. But when I got to law school, one of the first things that happened to me was one of my buddies, after first year, you try to figure out what law firm you're going to get to spend your summer with and on your way to conquering the world. And one of my friends ended up going to Nigeria and worked with a very small Nigerian law firm who happened to be the lawyer for a gentleman called Mr. Obasanjo. If you know your history, General Obasanjo was former military head of the army in Nigeria, and then he became military head of Nigeria, and he was the first military head to hand over rule of Nigeria into civilian rule. So he came with a very distinguished, particularly from a U.S. perspective, history. And Rob Fenner spent time with President Obasanjo's attorney, and came back after the summer and said, let's put on a symposium. Let's think about the African diaspora spread around the globe. And most of you know that roughly 1/4 of the people of African descent are thought to come from Nigeria around the globe. And so we did. We scraped together a few pennies. We didn't have much at that time, and invited a few delegates, and President Obasanjo agreed to come over and speak. I knew nothing about Africa and thought it was interesting, but never thought that it would have anything to do with, much to do with my life going forward. Fast forward a few years later, after law school, I joined Skadden Arps, who you may have heard of, in New York, but was interested in moving down I was in their 500 attorney office in New York, a young first-year associate trying to figure out how to make my mark in the world, and thought that I should move down to Skadden in Houston. And it was really purely a family issue that caused me to want to move. And one of the partners in New York said, "Hey, Sean, how are you going to like energy?" And I had no idea what energy meant. I said that. I have no idea, because I have no idea what energy is. In my mind, it was computers and things you see on TV. But I can say that fast forwarding 20 years later, it's I wouldn't change it for the world, because it has challenged every bit of my being, and I've been involved in many things that I never would have thought I would have. And I ended up joining Enron. I worked initially for them as, which was the big joke, Enron's attorney in China. Enron had this African-American guy running around China as their attorney who didn't speak any Mandarin, and working on oddly LNG to power transactions in China. When I walk down the street, every now and again, someone would get up the nerve to ask me, to come up to me and say, "Are you a basketball player?" Yeah, right. And I'd look down at them and I'd say, "No, I'm too short." Yeah. But it was a great fun, and that was my introduction to energy infrastructure and emerging markets. And at the time, we were chasing some very large projects in China, with this unique idea of bringing natural gas, liquefying it and transporting it to China and running power generation. And the Chinese central government at the time decided not to pursue those projects. They said, "Look, we have an abundance of coal in China, and the largest coal deposits in the world are in China, India, and the U.S. The U.S. is actually considered the Saudi Arabia of coal. But, as you guys will know today, if you've seen in the papers, coal to power generation in the U.S. is declining, even though we have an abundance of it. China, on the other hand, and India, on the other hand, decided to build up their coal generation to quite an extent. Today, however, China has 3 LNG import terminals, and so they did finally do LNG to power. But I migrated to Africa in 1997 from that period, and I was involved in a pretty large gas project to bring natural gas from Mozambique to South Africa. And as a result of that involvement, that project we sold to a South African company, and they build it and import natural gas into South Africa now. That was a small gas field at the time, considered 1 TCF. Now, if you look up Mozambique, Anadarko, and other players have huge natural gas fields offshore Mozambique, which they're looking to convert to liquefaction and sell that natural gas into Asia, high-priced Asian market. So the transition, 15 years later, from the markets in Africa is undergoing significant changes. I got involved after that project I was actually asked to head up Enron's activities in Africa, and we started focusing on West Africa. And we started looking heavily at Ghana. Ghana had a problem. They were using heavy fuel oils, expensive fuel oils to run their power generation. And 3 countries over, not very far, was Nigeria, which had a huge natural gas deposit. And so what they wanted to do was pipe natural gas from Nigeria over to Ghana. called the West African Gas Pipeline. And there were a number of players, not as many as there are today, were eager to cut a power deal in Ghana to bring natural gas from Nigeria into Ghana. And we said, look, instead of competing with those folks in Ghana, why don't we go over to Nigeria and do a power deal and pay for that expensive leg, which no one was figuring out how to pay for, to bring natural gas from the eastern portion of Nigeria, Delta region, over to the western portion of Nigeria. And so Nigeria, interesting enough, in 1999 was transitioning from military rule to democratic rule. And the front runner happened to be a person called President Obasanjo, who I had met years ago in law school, sitting right where you guys are. We were actually successful doing the first IPP in Nigeria. We did actually one of the fastest. If you know the IPP world, independent power generation world, it typically takes 3 to 5 years to take an idea of power, to put a power plant, to actually getting it to financial close, and then another 2 to 4 years to build it. We actually negotiated the power purchase agreement in 6 months, and spent another 12 months after that working on selling it to a company called AES. Today it stands as one of the most successful deals in the African market. We spent about $3 million putting that deal together, and we sold it with some power barges for $140 million. So fast forward today, the market in Africa is, as Professor Wilkins has said, intriguing to many investors. A number of investors looked at the China market and felt it was difficult in trying to figure out how to make money. And they don't want to miss that boat today in Africa. I think the fundamentals for Africa are undeniable, but there's still uncertainty on how you can actually invest capital and make a return in the market. So actually one of the shortages in the marketplace today are those folks who have been successful doing that. When I took over to head up Enron's business activities in Africa, I had lots of young folks come to me and said, you know what, I'm really interested in this market in Africa. Will you bring me on to your team? And I think you guys are going to do great things. And I had one question for them. And the question was really, why are you interested in Africa? And if they said to me that, I think there's lots of opportunities, look at the macroeconomics involved, I think there's transactions we can do in Africa. And I said, I think you're right, but thank you very much. And those folks who came to me and said, I studied Africa in school, I've always had an interest in the culture and the people. I said to those, look, we may be able to work together. And the reason is because all the economic fundamentals have to work. Otherwise, you're not going to get people to invest in the project. That has to be true in any project that you pursue. But Africa has a unique history that it's important to understand in terms of actually getting transactions done. Mm-hmm. And the folks on the team that I had at Enron were all folks who had a natural, I don't know if natural is the right word, but an interest in Africa beyond sort of economic benefits it can bring to us. And that was important because the connections that you have to establish with folks on the ground in Africa, both from the government to community, is broad. And you have to have a natural affinity to connect with folks so that you can get things done. The different skill sets and variety of skill sets and connections that you have to make to get these transactions done are very varied and sparse, and you have to be the type of person who can navigate between those. And if you can, put your fingers in the holes long enough to get the lenders to sign on the dotted line, to fund hundreds of $millions, then you can be successful. So you guys are in the exact right place, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Trey?
So y'all have done a great job convincing me that I want to go back to be in their shoes. So what advice, what I guess concrete advice might you give for their, if they decide that this is something they want to go, an area with the world they want to go help, improve and also, make some money, take care of your family, that sort of thing. What kind of advice would you give to get started out? To a room full of, we'll just assume they're all law school students, maybe some others in the room. But so if you're a law student, what advice would you tell them?
I don't want to dominate the conversation because I could talk forever here.
Don't
on this.
worry.
I will make
He's
sure
the
that you do
guy
not
doing
talk
the bit.
forever.
Believe me, he's going to listen to him.
There's a gavel.
You think now that he knows Norton Rose is in the picture, he's not going to listen? Go ahead.
Sean, I got a gavel in here, so.
Please.
The first thing I would say is, number one, I guess I should be full disclosure. I applied to one law school. I never intended to be a lawyer, but a professor convinced me that if I go to law school, I have a much broader array of opportunities available to me, which was absolutely true. Business guys, MBA, can't practice law, but lawyers can practice business. And in the world that I was involved in, project finance, actually being a lawyer gave you, made you head and shoulders above your business guys, because you know why? They wouldn't read the docs. They would not read the docs. So this leads me to as if you understand the risk profile in the projects, but also you have a willingness to understand the commercial and investment and financing side, you won't have any limits. While we were doing our very successful power project in Nigeria, our local partner, who came from a very substantial family, very prominent family, was also building his another business. It was a rice business. He was importing rice, but he also started a rice farm in Nigeria, and he was selling rice in Nigeria. And what struck me at the time was, as an American, I would have never thought about a rice business. And he would come in every day smiling because he was making a lot of money selling rice in the community. So number one advice is keep your minds open. I mean, these fundamentals that you learn in terms of financing, legal fundamentals, it's all very valuable, but also keep your minds open to the opportunities in these markets. There are endless opportunities in these markets that we take for granted today.
So do you want to
Sure.
comment as a lawyer?
Well, obviously, first thing, I'll definitely agree with everything my client said. But
That's how you become a good lawyer.
Exactly.
but more concretely, in terms of what you can be doing today to explore a career in Africa, two bits of advice. One is, when do you actually make that transition to focus on a region? And I have this discussion a lot with people who are considering coming to the Middle East and in a few cases about Africa. Because I prefaced my opening remarks by saying that Africa ultimately is not dissimilar from what's happening elsewhere in the world, there's a lot to be learned elsewhere. And cutting your teeth in a major center like Houston or New York or London and practicing for a couple of years out there first and bringing that experience that is well-rounded, that you've seen what everyone else is doing in the world, is actually gonna help you a lot, whether you're focusing in the Middle East or in Africa or elsewhere. So that's the first bit of advice. But that deferment should not mean, in actual practice, should not mean a deferment in learning about Africa. So I think that is something that you can start today, whether you're reading publications or business journals about what kind of deals, what kind of transactions are happening in Africa, to understand both the economics of the continent, but importantly also the historical and political culture of it, because that's going to be very relevant, and that sense of appreciation of history is going to be what will distinguish you as a good practicing lawyer or not. I mean, finally, on Sean's point on having business acumen, I can't agree anymore. I mean, a lot of lawyers are excellent lawyers. They dot every I, cross every T, but don't have the imagination to appreciate what the business deal, what the larger picture is. And it's very important when now you relatively have more time to try to develop your basic sense of business, your basic understanding of what is really driving this commercial transaction, because only then will you be able to actually draft for it. I mean, I was speaking actually a couple of days ago at a career fair at a high school in Dubai about the beauty of corporate law. And the analogy I gave them is that the corporate law, which is essentially contract law, boils down to you're being asked by your client to look into a crystal ball. And because of your experience, because of your training, you're asked to try to predict what contingencies are going to transpire in the future, and let us agree today how to deal and allocate the various risks involved in this particular transaction. And if you don't understand the business, if you don't understand the transaction, you're not going to be able to draft that good contract.
So I'll just say everything they say is completely right. Let me just give you a few more practical things. First of all, you should come work with me on my projects. So I'm going to be in Nigeria in 3 weeks, as some of you know. This is just a perfect example of the kind of thing that is happening. We run a series of executive education programs. Trey, you've got these at the Kennedy School as well. And one's called Leadership in Law Firms, and another's called Leadership in Corporate Counsel. And now, every year, we are getting top lawyers from Nigerian law firms, from companies in the Middle East, sovereign wealth fund general counsels, banking general counsels. We were just talking about a particularly brilliant guy who ran one of the largest banks in Saudi Arabia. And so my goal is to try to build a project that builds bridges in that space at the intersection of law and business and strategic planning and also economic development, because I think this is what you said so brilliantly, Sean. You know, we've already had colonialism in Africa once. They're not going to go for it twice, which means you better be coming with something. And you better be coming with something that is going to help development. Actually, on our executive education, Scott Westfall and Lisa Rohrer are back here in the room, and we are one of the things that they run our terrific executive education programs. And one of the things we're trying to do is build bridges between the JD curriculum and what we're doing with professionals. So those are two other people who I think would be very anxious to talk to you about the things that we're doing.
Why don't you guys raise your hand just so that
so that they see where you are and hang around afterwards, because we may, for example, one of the things I'll be doing when I'm in Lagos is talking to a group of Nigerian lawyers about maybe doing a program in which people would come here and spend some time in Cambridge. I think there'd be a lot of interest, and if they do, they'd be fascinated to meet you. I mean, whenever we get people who come here from around the world, one of the things they want to do most is meet students. And so we're going to try to build as many bridges for that as possible. And Lauren's going to help me organize a meeting before we go. And Khadija is here, and some other of my students are here, about trying to figure out how we can best build that kind of bridge. Two other quick things. Cross-register for courses. So talk to Trey and find out how to take courses at the Kennedy School. Take courses at the business school. I'd say the Kennedy School and the business school and many other, the Fletcher School of Government, they're way ahead of the law school in terms of thinking about the importance of Africa, and in particular building what my friend here said is that multidisciplinary skill set. In whatever you do in your life, as a lawyer, it's not going to be enough just to be a lawyer. You're going to have to be a problem solver. Actually, some of you are my students from the problem solving workshop, which means that you're going to have to figure out clients. You don't have legal problems. You have problems, of which law is a piece. And the more you can think about how to integrate law into that broader context of thinking about how to get solutions done that work for everyone, that don't just work for, that aren't one-sided transactions, but are win-win transactions, because those are the only ones that don't get nationalized, right? Or that don't have protests showing up at their door every day. The more you can do that, the better, and no better place than while you're here in school and have the privilege of learning really whatever you want.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If I might, Joe Dilk, who's Viennese managing partner,
Right.
I mean, he's just
Actually used to be Viennese.
Yeah,
You
he
need
used
to
to be.
keep up.
I always thinking about.
I watch these guys like baseball cards. Okay, I know everything.
Well, Joe was my attorney when I was negotiating with Denham Capital the deal with Endeavor, so and it made them nervous. But we don't mind paying fees for attorney. We don't even think about them when attorneys are very valuable, both in terms of the obviously on the legal issues, but on the business issues. And the attorneys that can think broadly about win-win solutions to solve these, we don't think twice about it. And it really doesn't matter how low an attorney's legal fees are if they're crap. If you it doesn't matter how low, we still ain't paying them. And I did exactly what Professor Wilkins said. I took accounting courses over at the business school, and I took other courses and tried to broaden I didn't want to limit myself to sort of one mode. And again, to reiterate, Africa is the place that you ought to be. When I started with Skadden, the guys that started making partner quicker than their contemporaries, there were the guys that were willing to go set up shop in, at the time, Hong Kong, Singapore, and other locations. And so when I look at a law firm today, my first question to them is, okay, what countries have you been active and done deals in? Because I don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. I want to learn from what they've already learned from. And so these things are very important. And if you're wondering whether it's the right time for Africa, I'll tell you who I was in Nigeria last week, and I'll tell you who I was sitting with in Lagos. You may have heard of him, Jeff Immel. And we were talking about power in Nigeria, power in Africa. How do they, and Jeff said something interesting. He said, look, 5 years ago, they did about $500 million of sales in Africa. They're doing over $2 billion now, and he's trying to add another zero to that number. So, it's serious. It's a serious time. People are getting very serious about investing in community, which I'm very excited about because, I've been waiting for Africa's renaissance, and I'm hopeful to be a part of it.
Good. We've got time for a couple questions, probably. If you've got, if you want to come up to the microphone. I'm going to import some Kennedy School JFK Jr. forum rules. So tell us your name, your affiliation, and make sure your question ends with a question mark and is not that long.
Okay. Hi, my name is Prima. I'm an LLM at the law school. I'm from Uganda, and we just discovered oil in Uganda, so it's a very exciting time for us. So very interested in the workshop today. And my question is more of a dilemma because it's when we're talking about Africa and how it's emerging, and it's very exciting because of the prospects of the big deals that are coming up, right? But then there's also the prospects for exploitation, because when we're reading about like oil in Uganda, we're reading about how, statistics show probably 60, not even above 60% is the revenue is not going to be enjoyed by Ugandans, right? So how do you balance the big deals, which are probably taking the money out of the country, with the social utility which needs the country to benefit from the resources? Thank you.
Good question.
Easy one for me to answer.
Yes,
A couple
please.
things. One of the reasons why oil in particular and commodities have been invested in for a long period of time is because the revenue was generated from outside the African markets. That's changing, and it was the sort of biggest impetus to that change was in the telecom, mobile phone industry. People figured out, and there's a few reasons why, but they figured out that they can make money investing in industries that rely on sort of local community and the country markets. the reason telecom was so successful was, number one, it was a leapfrog in technology for telecom industry. No longer did you have to string wires now across land. You can leapfrog that, but more importantly, the mobile phones you were able to turn off mobile phones if people didn't pay. And there was this prepay system that started in Europe that could be easily employed. And so the risk associated with getting a return on your investment was significantly reduced. But what it did was it demonstrated that investors can make huge returns, as Professor Wilkins said, had the largest growth in Africa in mobile phones. And people weren't sure they were like, here's the GDP per capita, very low. Are you really going to be able to make money in this market? And it proved that you can. So now people are more willing to invest in local markets. And there's some trends, urbanization, and some other things that are going on that are proving this out. But one of the biggest things that happened tied to mobile phones was mobile phones were allowed people to communicate within Africa. So one of the guys that works for me, Ahmed, worked for me at Enron, great guy, super smart, went to the Kellogg Business School. When there was an election in Senegal, this was sort of 8 years ago, I was talking to Ahmed, and he said, you know what? People went to the polls and they were able to text their friends and tell who they voted for. And it sort of changed the environment in African countries in that now political leadership in Africa had to be more sensitive to the needs of African community. So as a result, now what you see, guys like me coming in to invest, one of the questions is okay, what's your local content? I was involved in the South Africa renewable IPP bidding round, and one of the requirements was you had to bid in your local, what you were going to do, not just money, but also management, personnel involvement in your projects. And the political leadership around Africa are understanding that this is very important. Part of what they have to do to get reelected is to create jobs, just like we think about in the U.S. and Europe. And so, they're putting that burden on private private investors to tell them, how are you going to create jobs in their community? And that's very important. As part of our project criteria, when we look at a project, and I take it to Denham's investment committee, is to talk about what's our local investor involvement in our project. So we want the local community invested in our project, but also what are our dollars being spent to in terms of the local community to give back in the community, not because we're altruistic, but because we think it makes a stronger project. I should have mentioned that Denham Capital, which the investor in Endeavor, grew up out of Harvard endowment. Harvard actually, Stu Porter, who founded Denham, came out of Harvard Management Company. Harvard actually funded their first two funds. Now they've spread out and have multi-investors, but most of it are endowments and family offices. And actually, out of their sixth fund, which we're are owned out of, Bill Gates is the largest investor out of that fund. So Harvard plays an important role in many ways you can imagine.
So here's the most important thing. You could go back to Uganda. I'm not joking. How is Uganda or Nigeria, or I've been in Kenya, I've been in Tanzania, I've spent a lot of time in South Africa. The biggest thing is capacity building in those countries. When we think about capacity building, most of the attention, and frankly, most of the attention at Harvard Law School for perfectly good reasons, is around human rights, it's around land, it's around water rights. But here's what I think, where we need capacity building, fancy corporate lawyers who can cut fair deals, right? Who read the documents, understand the documents. And that means we need people who are trained to the highest standards in the global legal marketplace. So that's why he's absolutely right. Go work in New York, go work in London, get an LLM from Harvard, but then go home And if you look at why China, Brazil, and India have all become very successful, it is not a coincidence that they have developed quite sophisticated lawyers who try to get the best education possible, including coming to our executive education programs to learn how to do things like run law firms. There were never any law firms to run in these countries, but to make deals that work. And I think the best investors, not all investors, but the best investors realize that the deal has to be fair enough for both sides for it to be sustainable over time.
That's right.
And that's where the returns come in. And that's where you develop the local market. If you look at what's happening in China, the reason why Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang are concentrating on pushing development into the interior of China, they're trying to turn away from an export-driven economy. Because if they're too much of an export-driven economy, guess what? Then when we screw up and we can't get our act together and we can't balance the budget, then they suffer. And so the best investments are the ones that are not solely dependent on export-driven, even in the energy sector, right? Yeah. The energy market is slowing down, in fact, because China can't afford to pay for it anymore because they can't sell enough toys to us. So, you know, if you look at the economy, think about how you can make yourself valuable to the building of capacity in your country or the countries that you're interested in so that they can be real players on the global stage that develop themselves.
I'll just add just a very brief relevant story for this, which goes into the increasing sophistication of IOCs, international oil companies, when striking these deals. The beauty of energy deals is that they're not, a one-year deal. They're typically a 15, 20-year concession. And because of what's happened elsewhere in the Caspian or Russia and elsewhere, where the IOCs were very successful post the fall of the Berlin Wall in getting very lucrative deals. But what happened, that a lot of these governments woke up and realized that they need to claw back the economics. And how did they do that? They did that by imposing environmental fines, tax fines, etc., which were all ways of saying, guys, it was a raw deal, we're gonna get it back. And invariably in all of these cases, the original documents got reopened and renegotiated. So in reality, the best protection is for governments to actually hire very good lawyers who can assist them with the process of negotiation, as well as educating the other side. I was advising a couple of years ago the Iraqi government on a very large gas project. It was a $17 billion investment. They had already negotiated the basic documents, and it was an incredibly lopsided deal. We actually spent 2 extra years pretty much rewriting the documents and trying to retilt the balance in favor of the government. And the other side, to their credit, were very receptive. The junior guys who were negotiating were not happy with us. They hated us, and they kept telling the government, oh, those lawyers are trying to sabotage and run the clock, etc. But when you talk to the country head above, they completely understood the proposition that if you want a sustainable deal that will not be torn the minute it's signed, it has to be fair, and it has to be perceived to be fair and transparent. So that is one of many examples where having a credible, experienced lawyer on the side of the government ended up being beneficial. And because, especially in an age where it's fairly transparent what others get in other countries. And you as a lawyer are able to bring in that know-how and that experience. This is how it was done here. This is how it's done in the other country. And this is how we're different, so we need to tweak it here and there. That's the kind of know-how and expertise that the governments in Africa would appreciate.
We will actually pay for advisors for the government to negotiate against us, so that we can have a fairer deal and more sustainable deal. In the project I mentioned, the Mozambique project, we negotiated a very detailed gas transportation term sheet with the government. And during the whole process, we kept telling the government, you really ought to get advisors on your side to negotiate with us. And they didn't, they didn't want to do that. And we actually had Tony Way, one of the world-renowned gas negotiators, worked for Enron. And we negotiated a 40-page term sheet. And then when we went back, and this was a lesson that I learned early on in my career, when we went back to negotiate the gas transportation agreement, they got advisors. And when we were going through negotiate the agreement, we were comparing the term sheet to the agreement, and one of their advisors said, you have this provision here. Why do you need that? And Tony Way and I looked at each other just like this. And we turned back to the advisor and we said, we'll get back to you. Because we had no reason, it was just so favorable to us. But the problem is we lost a lot of goodwill that we had established when they got the advisor, that there was no real good reason for some of the terms and provisions that we had. And it was a lesson to me that, negotiate a fair deal. So when, 3 years later, when I was negotiating the power purchase agreement again with the government of Nigeria, we had very good relationships with the government. And my team was over there negotiating. I called them up one day. I said, look, let's sit down and let's go through the power purchase agreement. And I was back in Houston. They were over there. And, we were talking. And after a few minutes, they said, hey, Sean, you're all the points you're raising are their points. And I said, I know. And I said, I've learned a lesson that at the end of the day, we need to negotiate a reasonable deal. Yes, depending on the time, there's a lot of risks we can't take, but let's take the risks that we can take in this market. And, so that's what we did.
It's a great story.
Well, our lunch hour has come to a close. Please join me in thanking Sean, David, and Ahmed for this great conversation.